right, guys. Hey, it's Jonathan Edwards here. Welcome to another video or an audio, depending on where you are. But listen, as a disclaimer, as always, I work with aspiring athletes and their families. These are families who've got big athletic dreams and they're really go for it. My advice is geared towards them. So with that in mind, some of that advice may not rub you the right way if you are not as kind of into it or committed. If you aren't willing to take 100% responsibility for your athletic experience, if you're going to blame coaches, blame the weather, blame something other than yourself, this probably isn't the advice for you. So if you're going to hang out, that's fine. Leave appropriate comments where necessary. But again, just a little disclaimer, this advice isn't for everybody. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Let's get started. 100% responsibility. So I'll be honest, this is easier to talk about than sometimes it is to do. Okay. And for a great conversation on this, there's a book by Jack Canfield. I got it right here. And I wrote about this in my book, in An Athlete's Guide to Winning in Sports and Life. But this is the Success Principles book by Jack Canfield. It's a big book. It's really cool. And there's a chapter in there on 100% responsibility. I totally recommend that book. It's a great resource for athletes if you don't have mine already. So go buy mine. But what we run into here is that most of the world, and this is true, most of the world thinks that they are entitled to a great life. And I put out an Instagram post a couple weeks ago that just said, and this is a Jim Rohn quote. It's just, don't wish that things were easier, wish that you were better. Every day when I come to my desk, I take a little moment where I curse the world, but then I turn it right around and I go, everything I've done has brought me to this point. And that doesn't feel great sometimes. That doesn't feel great sometimes. And, you look back on decisions you made and regret them, but really all you can do, and the most successful people I know, they focus on the now and they focus on, they basically focus on the future. That's it, the now or the future. So you can't necessarily dwell on the past. You can only do that. So this overall global feeling of that, hey, athletes, the people feel entitled to a great life goes to athletes too. And so, harshly or not harshly, whichever way you want to look at it, the Naomi Osaka situation that we just talked about is such maybe she feels entitled to not have to deal with bad questions and be able to have better questions asked of her at press conferences that don't make her feel bad. Well, that's just the media, dude. So the truth is, though, that athletes and parents fall into these traps where they blame other things. They blame things outside of themselves, things that they can control. So whether it's the media or the coaches or the weather or the travel or the ref or their equipment, or the fact they feel like the other team or the other athletes have better resources than they do, whatever it may be. The idea is that whatever you can name, they'll blame. Hey, that rhymes. That was not my intent to make that rhyme, but it did. What needs to happen is that when an athlete blames something outside of themselves, right? And if a parent feeds into this, by the way, like I work with a lot of goalies, and sometimes parents will say, "Oh, well, that shot was too hard to get. You weren't expected to get that shot." Now all learning has stopped, all capability has stopped. I was on today doing a coaching call with an athlete, and the athlete said, I missed that shot, but I'm not supposed to get it. It's all good. But then I asked him, I said, well, what do you think you could have done to get it? And with that little shift, he spit out a whole bunch of things. And so that's where the learning comes from, right? So when you take 100% responsibility for something that you think is out of your control, you can learn from it, right? So one of the things that Jack Canfield writes, the first place I heard this was from that Jack Canfield book that I just talked about, the Success Principles, was this concept of E plus R equals O, right? So the event plus your response equals your outcome, right? Equals your outcome. So because you can have two athletes have the same event happen to them, and they'll have two different responses, and then their outcomes are different. So I wrote about this in my book. This story when I was in Eagles, Austria. It was kind of this weird weather day, and the weather was, it was kind of snowing, kind of raining, kind of foggy, kind of sunny, kind of whatever. And the overall conversation in the start house went something like, some athletes were like, I like the snow. And other athletes were like, I hate the snow. Some athletes were like, I like when it's really sunny out and cold. And other athletes were like, I like it when it's a little warmer. Right. And when the fog goes, I feel comfy in my suit and things like that. Like that, these were all these conversations happening. And it was at that moment that I realized, like, wow, if I can adopt the belief that allows me to succeed in whatever situation I'm in, then I have the best chance to succeed, right? Because some athlete is doing that, right? We all have athletes who play well in the rain or don't play well in the rain or compete well under the lights on Sunday nights. I always love in football when Monday Night Football happens and it's under the lights and it's all this TV watching it. Some athletes do real well, others kind of shy away. And what does the press ask? Hey, why do you not do so well on Monday nights? Now that athlete has to deal with that, has to learn how to overcome that. Okay. But one of the things that happens is that your athlete can either take an experience and flip it for the good or blame it on something else and lose all the learning. And then now that's out of their control. So when I was left off my first Olympic team with Mark Grimet, we, as bummed out as we were, we went through the whole grieving process, and we'll talk about that in a second. But we decided that the next Olympics, we were going to be so damn good that they had to pick us. And that's what we did. Right. So, what I tell all my parents is that, sport is all about, and I only learned this very late, but sport is very much about like managing grief, right? Managing grief and getting feedback and then taking action on that feedback. That's really what sports is all about. Managing grief, getting feedback, taking action on that feedback. So the stages of grief, for those of you guys that don't know that. So the first thing is if an athlete loses, so you think of Michaela Schifrin, dealing with the loss of her dad, or Naomi Osaka walking out of her press conference going like, oh my God, this sucks. So the first stage is grief and denial, right? So your athlete loses an event, or even as a parent, your athlete could care less about something, but as a parent, you're really hoping that they get picked for a team. And it doesn't happen. Well, the athlete is going to go through their grieving and you're going to go through your grieving too. And as a parent, your grief and grieving can affect your athlete's grieving as well. It usually drags it out. All right. So the first stage is shock and denial. The second stage is pain and guilt, right? Like, just bummed out, upset, tears, guilty that they just didn't make it happen. Things like that, just wallowing. These are really negative emotions. The third stage is anger and bargaining, right? Like you're like pissed at the world and you're like, oh man, if that athlete breaks their leg, then I'll go, or if, well, I'm never good with bargaining examples because I'm not very good at it, but if they could buy their way onto a team or things along those lines, that's anger and bargaining. Then depression sets in. Okay. And athletes feel bummed out, right? But depression isn't, it's not a definition. It's not a place to be stuck. It's a feeling to move through, okay? And depending on the preparation of your athletes, the idea is, depending on the preparation of your athlete, they'll be ready for this situation or not. And that's really important to understand. Okay. Something is calling me on my phone. What I want you to know is that you can prepare your athlete and prepare yourself as a family to realize that these are the stages that you're going to feel and you're going to move through that. So taking 100% responsibility then is not as risky, because some people don't want to take responsibility because they don't want to feel bad, right? They don't want to realize like, man, you know what? I could have done this. I could have done X, Y, and Z, right? But if they understand that these are the feelings they're going to go through, then they'll move through them quickly. And depression is one of those stages, right? So it's like, I worked with a soccer player years ago, and his dad had like a 24-hour, you can feel shitty for 24-hour clause, right? You have a big loss, whatever, 24 hours, tomorrow night, I don't want to deal with you. You come back, you're happy. Okay. So that's okay, but that's a little harsh, but everybody goes through it differently. But the most important thing was that this athlete, Charlie, he knew that, hey, after an event, I'm going to be bummed out. I'm going to be angry. I'm going to go through these stages. I'm going to be depressed. I'm going to think that none of this is going to work out. But then that leads an athlete to the fifth stage, which is called the upward turn. All right. When things start to turn up a little bit. And probably I can guarantee you, like Naomi Osaka with this whole press scandal thing, is she's already probably in that things are turning up stage. She's like, oh, okay, it wasn't that bad. It's not that big of a deal, right? I guarantee you that's where she's headed. The thing that is kind of fascinating is that when you get into the upward turn, now that's where the learning really starts to happen, right? It's the optimism. And I'm working on a new book, and the first chapter is all about optimism, and it's really part about this upward turn, right? And so then stage 6 is what's called reconstruction. That's where an athlete, and this is what Mark and I did when we didn't make the Olympic team, is we got to the stage of reconstruction going like, okay, where did we mess up? Whether we messed up, it was, Olympic trials, but then also it was like, well, what about our sled? What about our starts? We decided then like we were going to have the best starts in the world, and that's what we worked towards, and we did, and it was awesome. Right. But that's where that reconstruction and working through the situation goes so that the athlete can kind of come out the other side. So Naomi Osaka and these press issues, how can she, reconstruction? Well, how could I better handle that question from that reporter? Right. Is there anything we can do to minimize the question from getting asked in the first place, or just giving me a tool with which to answer it? What can I do? That's reconstruction, right? Michaela Schifrin, when her dad died, when she knew she was going back out to ski, she knew she was going to have to deal with the press, the media. People were going to be asking her questions. People were going to grieve for her. They're going to go through their own grieving process, but she's going to go, sometimes this happens. You want to get through the grief, but everybody else around you is still kind of bummed out, or vice versa. You want to still wallow in it just a little bit longer, but everybody else is like, come on, let's go. Right. Both are good. Right. And then the final stage is acceptance and hope, right? So when an athlete takes responsibility for everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, especially the bad and the ugly, they're going to go through these feelings, these stages of grief, right? And they're all going to come with their different levels of feeling bad, right? Some are worse than others, but the idea is that there are phases with which to work through. You're not necessarily going to get stuck in them, okay? So I like, the Naomi Osaka, Michaela Schifrin comparison, right? Two very distinct differences here. But Michaela Schifrin also went through a phase where, when her dad died, she was like, I don't want to talk to anybody. She stopped skiing. People were wondering if she was ever going to ski again. She's just going through those grief stages. And really, so when you take the responsibility, she knew like, okay, no, I'm going to have to come back here. And so she did that. So, right, when you learn the skills to come out of it, right, that's what taking responsibility gives you, even if it's something that's out of your control. This blew my mind when I first really thought about this, right? Like, so a lot of athletes, like, let's say they go to an event, doesn't matter what the sport, and the weather is not ideal for that athlete. And I say it in that way because there's some athlete out there where that athlete is ideal. It's like, so to use an NFL example, there's football teams that play in stadiums that are outside, and then there's football teams that play in stadiums that are indoors, right? Where the environment is always controlled, no matter what the season. And there's this ridiculous stat when it comes to the Super Bowl, which is played outside, not always, but primarily it's played outside. That the quarterback that has practiced in an outdoor environment has a better chance of winning. Why? Because they're used to gripping the ball in the snow and the rain and mud and things like that. Whereas that quarterback that only plays indoors is always grabbing a nice, fresh, dry ball, right? So you can either decide that I'm only good throwing balls that are dry and fresh, or I'm going to learn the skills with which to throw a really good, a ball in any condition. And so that's where environment is a perfect example, because there's always an athlete that learns to just accept that environment. And it's not just about accepting the environment, but learning the skills with which to thrive in that environment, right? And so environment is people, places, and things. So your athlete, you know, the people they're going up against, their competitors or their teammates or their coaches or their fans, that's part of the environment. They're so people, places, like, indoors, outdoors, sunny, snowy, cold, wet, rainy, whatever. And then things, different equipment, different jerseys, uh, different grounds, like terrain, things like that. Like those, your athlete is either going to figure those things out or they're not, right? And if they're not, and they're going to blame those things for their result, they're not going to learn, and they're never going to learn, and that's really, really important. So I want uh, again, I think of the Alex Albon Formula One story, where his mom is like kind of this international super spy, not super spy. She's like went to prison for fraud or something like that. He had to learn how to deal with being a Formula One race driver, knowing that the press is going to ask about those things, right? And so that's true for every athlete. They're going to have to know. Okay. Um, so I love this term that Jack Canfield wrote about this idea from victim to victory. Okay. I think one of the worst things that's happening in sport is when, an athlete goes through an abuse situation with a coach. And there was another one today in the press um, about the Chicago Blackhawks hockey team and not dealing well with a coach that they had. And there was like a sexual abuse issue there. But there is the from victim to victory. And what a lot of people who are in love with the soap opera in these situations, they're like, oh, they just project like victim mentality onto the athlete. And and I don't ever want my athletes to have a victim mentality, right? Because when you're a victim and you leave things out of your control, you realize like you have no hope, right? You have no ability. You're just in grief mode, and you're stuck in those like first four phases of grief mode, right? You're stuck in anger and denial, and you're stuck in pain and guilt, and stuck in depression and anger and bargaining and all that stuff. You never get out because you feel like a victim. But when you realize that you can take responsibility and go, like, even in the worst situation, there's something about me that I did, there's something that brought me into that situation. And and I use the example of, like, if you wore a suit of hot dogs and jumped into a dog pound, okay, you can blame the dogs for attacking you, or you can realize, like, all right, they're wired a certain way, and I'm probably not in the best situation here. Now, maybe you didn't know there were dogs in there. Maybe you didn't know it was a dog pound. That's okay. You can get out there real quick and then learn from it and go, like, I'm never doing that again. So my point is that there's a little bit on both sides of the fence there. But the side on the athlete where I don't want them to be a victim. I want them to realize that yes, it feels shitty right now, but they can then come out of it. And that comes from taking 100% responsibility. And that's the most successful people I know have done that. And it's pretty damn cool, right? To see it happen in their life. So I want the message to you, to your athlete, to be, no matter how bad things have gotten for you, you might have lost an event. You might have been, things from little stuff all the way down to the most horrendous stuff, is that there's a way to take responsibility and to move beyond it. And it's going to feel crappy. And there's going to be people that tell you that I'm full of it and it's not true. But the truth is, to move on in your life and to have a better result, like in sport and in life, is to take 100% responsibility. All right. So I know that's a tough one for people, but I hope that makes sense.